Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Today we have Daniel Mahoney to discuss with us all things liberalism. Daniel Mahoney holds the Augustine Chair and Distinguished Scholarship at Assumption College. He's the author of many books, essays, and reviews, including most recently, The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. He's also author of The Other, Solzhenitsyn, and currently is working on a book called The Statesman as Thinker, 10 Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation. Dan Mahoney, you are one of the most trenchant, wise voices in conservative political thought out there. We're glad to welcome you back to Liberty Law Talk.
Oh, my great pleasure, Richard.
Dan, a situation that has bothered me, it's bothered you. It's a very recent controversy amongst many other recent controversies they keep piling on, is the fallout inside the editorial board of the New York Times, a newspaper that bills itself as the leading newspaper in our country. The end of last week and the beginning of this week, the second week of June, there was intense controversy over an op-ed written by Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton that was published in the initial days of the protests and the riots, where he called for the military to be deployed. And the content of that op-ed, as many will now know, led to an internal revolt, particularly among younger editors and staffers in the New York Times, who said that this piece constituted violence, particularly against their minority friends, and was unacceptable and should not have been published by the New York Times. This has now led to the resignation of the editor of the editorial page, James Bennett. Ross Douthat today, Friday, June 12th, his column takes his colleagues to task. And he says they are now engaged in something that supersedes liberalism. It is a psychology of anger. It's a psychology of paralysis, crisis, over identities, and seeks to use words really as weapons, not as an attempt to understand truth or political reason. Your thoughts on what, if anything, this crisis might mean for American liberalism?
Well, I think for a long time now, American liberalism has been post-liberal or anti-liberal in a very aggressive way. By the way, we can talk more about whether or not the American political order, rightly understood, is simply a liberal order. I don't think it quite is just a liberal order, but it has a very important liberal component. And that has to do with respect for dialogue, respect for persons, respect for fundamental liberties, a proper prejudice against censorship, against the idea, not that there's truth, but that any person simply possesses the absolute truth and has the right to impose that on everyone else, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, perhaps going back to the 60s, where we saw the rise of anti-communism, and then, on a series of cultural issues, a tendency to write off half of the American population as deplorable or homophobic, or, to make it out like pro-life Americans are anti-woman. So these kind of currents been around for a long time. But in the last 10 days, or 2 weeks, we've seen a tremendous radicalization of a large part of really not liberal left. These are categories, as Ross Douthat probably says, that are far beyond the liberal order, that are filled with anger. By the way, I would add, these are not voices that defend human dignity, because they have replaced one absolutely unacceptable position, that some people, some races are superior to another. And by the way, very few Americans ever defended that proposition, even when racism was rampant in American society. They've replaced it with a different kind of Manichaeanism. They are absolutely certain who the victims are. They are permanent victims. They're absolutely certain who the oppressors are. And they demonize the oppressors, who are whole groups of people and not persons who share mutual accountability. And they justify the silencing and perhaps much worse in the future of those who have been demonized. So I would say, if you listen to my words, what we are witnessing at the New York Times and our universities, among the wider intellectual clerisy, is a totalitarian logic. Not totalitarian yet in practice, fully totalitarian, but it's heading in that direction. And it's not even a particularly soft totalitarianism. It is a justification of silencing many people of goodwill who do not accept it's a new logocracy, to quote Che Milos. It's the tyranny of ideological cliches. And I'm afraid that's increasingly our present. And if unless people resist and show intellectual and civic courage, it's most certainly our future. So the episode of the New York Times is what Charles Péguy called a cas éminent, an eminent case that reveals the new illiberal logic at work, or proto-totalitarian logic at work.
When you say totalitarian logic, you refer to, and you're alluding to it, I mean, this position that one group is ontologically a victim and can do no wrong. Another group is ontologically an oppressor and can do no right. Where does that lead?
Well, it's a fully totalitarian logic. As you know, I've written widely on Alexander Solzhenitsyn, perhaps the greatest human being of the 20th century, and Solzhenitsyn insisted over and over again that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, not through races or classes, nations or regimes. And we need to judge human beings as persons. When we condemn whole groups as intrinsically evil, as you say, ontologically evil, evil in their being, and others as victims who, and by the way, the victimization part is just as bad as the demonization part, because, as somebody like Frederick Douglass pointed out, or Booker T. Washington in a very different way, Black Americans, like all human beings and all Americans, need a certain degree of pride, of self-respect and self-help. And when they're told they lack agency, when we're all told we lack agency, that we're simply prisoners of fate, that we are either ontologically innocent or guilty, we've destroyed the freedom, the agency, the mutual accountability at the heart of human dignity and Republican self-government. So, it's really the idea. When I see our civil institutions, when I see our intellectual clerisy bowing before a Black Lives Matter ideology, I'm not talking about the idea that all Black Lives Matter. Of course they matter. All lives matter. But the ideology that accompanies that particular movement, which is not an anti-racist ideology, it's an ideology of victimization and demonization. It's anti-Black. It's anti-human. It's fully totalitarian in its logic and effects.
How did it come to pass? And I'm just sticking with this thread of the New York Times. A newspaper composed of, we might say, certainly a class with great credentials. I imagine most of the writers and editors Ivy League educated. Certainly we've known for decades this is the not just leading newspaper in America, but leading source of liberal opinion. What made the liberalism of the New York Times susceptible to accepting the logic of these, quite frankly, millennial editors and staff writers that, language is violence and silence is complicity in it, or something like that? How did that happen?
Well, it happened because our university, Gramsci's Long March to the Institution, this ideology that is eating away at our civility, our freedom, our mutual accountability, it has been in the universities for a long time now. It colonized humanities departments. It became the default language. English departments don't teach literature. They teach post-colonialism, a kind of para-Marxism, another version of that ideological Manichaeism and ontological demonization we just spoke about. These people were educated. They weren't educated in the great books. They weren't educated in the Western tradition. They weren't educated in the values of civilized order, ordered liberty. They were educated in agitprop. And I think I said this many years ago that eventually the spirit of illiberalism, of hate, of ideology that has instantiated ourselves in our colleges and universities and our intellectual class would come to infect the body politic. And I think that's what happened. Why do increasing number of millennials praise Marxist-Leninist regimes, think communism is a beautiful idea? Why do they buy into a loathsome culture of repudiation, to use the late great Sir Roger Scruton's phrase? I think they've never been exposed to an alternative. I think the agitprop begins early. You know, Howard Zinn and the 1619 Project, avant la lettre in the high schools and junior highs. You go to school, and instead of being challenged by what Matthew Arnold called the best that's been thought and said, for the most part, unless you know better, you are initiated in this language of victimization and demonization. And there's a point I made in The Idol of Our Age that I think is more relevant than ever. I argued that our present situation is marked by a mixture of toxic relativism and toxic moralism. When you no longer have rational standards of judgment that are the basis of a regime of civility and reason, then there's no restraints on moral indignation or anger, because nothing, no judgment is ever judged before the tribunal of reason. Michael Polanyi called this a moral inversion, that people are officially relativistic, but morality goes underground and comes back as moralistic indignation and ideological fanaticism. That's exactly where we are. That pattern of anti-reason, of toxic moralism, toxic relativism, you know, if it didn't completely dominate the universities, it was the leading force, the leading presence, and now it's invaded the body politic. And let me add one more thing. Alibeth and Solon, speaking about why so many liberals and left liberals were taken in by communism, or today perhaps by a certain softness toward radical Islam, he says they confused the homonyms. So when the communists talked about justice, peace, and equality, they did not mean what Christians meant by justice, peace, and equality, or conservatives and liberals mean by that. These were homonyms with a very, very different meaning. But, you know, liberation theologians, progressive Christians got taken in. Lots of political pilgrims got taken. I think the same thing's going on now. I think a lot of people of goodwill, I'm not sure whether these younger militants are people of goodwill, but many of them are sort of taken in by the homonyms. They think when they endorse anti-racism, they're endorsing anti-racism. We should endorse anti-racism, but on the grounds of rational assertion of human dignity and liberty, not on the grounds of ideological demonization. So, but the sickness has been around for a long time, but now it's metastasizing throughout the body politic.
The toxic relativism was to clear the way. You undermined, you dismissed, mocked, ignored, laughed at. I'll say a stand-in, I'll say Jerusalem. You laughed at Athens. You dismiss the bedrock foundation of American constitutionalism as racist. You say our society is built on slavery. All of those things clear the way for something else to replace it. Do we have a coherent sense of what those in the streets right now in June are trying to erect in its place? It seems to me there's a lot of demands. We see corporate America, scurrying to try and placate them, trying in many cases to enlist themselves in their cause or to be seen as such. Is there a coherent package yet, or is that or is that to come once they think they've got, one, if not both political parties subservient to what they want?
No, there's no coherent project. It's a project of intellectual, political, and moral destruction. That's why I mentioned Dostoevsky's demons. When you see educated Russian society, members, middle class, educated people, rich people, regime officials, intellectuals, mouthing the slogans of nihilists, a radical culture of repudiation, as you said. You attack our religious traditions rooted in, this rich tradition of logos and of ethical affirmation in scripture and the larger religious traditions. If you reject the metaphysical truths and the practical reason inherent in Athens, in our philosophical tradition, if you assault the West as an essentially culpable civilization. One of my favorite lines is from W.B. Yeats, "Come fix the accusing eye on me, I thirst for accusation." Well, if the West, which is the only truly self-critical civilization in history, is ontologically condemnable, we're talking about nihilism. We're talking about nothingness. So they have no positive program except self-loathing. Well, if these rituals we're looking at, again, we haven't reached the point of blood or official tyranny, and hopefully we'll never reach it. But the structure of it is so similar to that self-loathing one saw in Paris in '68, or in Dostoevsky's novel, or in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That somehow the idea that negation is liberating, or somehow serve. This is so anti-political because it cannot give rise to reform. It can only destroy. And in fact, I don't know how this kind of indignation goes on forever. It destroys agency, it destroys dignity, it destroys the pride necessary for common life. So I don't, but while it lasts, it's a force of pure destructiveness.
How does a tough-minded liberalism begin to respond?
Well, a tough-minded liberalism is also a tough-minded conservatism. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order. Pure liberalism has always been a problem. Freedom without ends and purposes, progress without tradition. Michael Polanyi once said, the sort of goals of Tom Paine can only work if they're wedded to the ideas of Edmund Burke, tradition, continuity, order, civilization. So a liberal order, first and foremost, can only survive and be worthy of surviving if it repudiates the culture of repudiation. If it renews itself with respect for our principles of our order, which are not racist. I was appalled the other day to see a piece of public discourse, otherwise fine piece by Marco Rubio, saying the American founders believed that blacks were 3/5 of the human being. The old canard, it was the anti-slavery North that wanted to count blacks as 3/5 for representation, precisely because they didn't want a slave-owning oligarchy to dominate the new constitutional order.
The men who introduced the 3/5 compromise were men from northern states who were opposed to slavery. I think it was Elbridge Gerry and James Wilson. If you read the debates, I'm not sure.
Absolutely.
It's incredible.
And by the way, you could not even find a South Carolinian in 1787 who said slavery was a positive good. At least anyone at the Constitutional Convention or in the ratifying debates. That all developed, as we know, much later with people like George Fitzhugh and John Calhoun. Yeah, but what's going to happen is, under the guise of anti-racism, a false anti-racism, a racist anti-racism, an ideological approach to things, our past is going to be erased. So for me to publicly make the argument, as Frederick Douglass did in 1852, that our Constitution is a fundamentally anti-slavery document. To make the kinds of arguments that the great Abraham Lincoln made in, I should also say the great Frederick Douglass, made in his Peoria address of 1854 and the Cooper Union address 6 years later, showing that in no sense, the Supreme Court was wrong in Dred Scott when they said the Declaration and Constitution are instruments of oppression. They're instruments of ordered liberty, of human dignity. And they were, as Martin Luther King still recognized in his famous speech in I Have a Dream in November 1963, it's precisely been going back to those promissory notes, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, that our political order is able to actualize our founding principles, which are principles of liberty and human dignity. So, but I'm absolutely convinced that the new ideology will say, if I make the argument of Frederick Douglass, of Abraham Lincoln, of Martin Luther King, I am ipso, I don't mean me personally, but anyone who makes this argument is ipso facto racist, or this is a form of violence. So you remember Eric Voegelin's definition of ideology, that it's the forcible imposition of a second reality on the real world. I think that's what we're seeing now.
And Voegelin says you can't ask questions.
That's right. You know, the reason why in his probably most polemical book, Science, Politics, and Gnosticism from 1959, Voegelin said that Heidegger and Marx, Nietzsche were swindlers, was he said in every case, whether it's Nietzsche's atheism or Marx's atheism and revolutionism or Heidegger's turn to Hitler in 1933, you're just not allowed. I'll give you an example. In Part 2 of the Communist Manifesto, Marx is making his argument for the four abolitions of property, family, religion, and nation. And he says, I am not even going to respond to arguments made against my position in the name of natural right or natural justice. He just dismisses any kind of moral or philosophical or political objection. And of course, Marxism was just one example of explaining that away, attributing nefarious motives to people who are simply philosophizing, searching for truth. So this is where we're heading. We will not be able to ask questions, and we will not be able to dissent from answers that are not rooted in empiricism. And by empiricism, I don't mean positivism. I just mean the world around us, experience. So we're going to be forbidden to raise the questions or to provide dissenting answers.
Oh, I mean, we've been talking about this throughout the interview. It's this position also of your thought is determined by who you are. You aren't actually capable of reason, of logic, of conscience, of subjectivity. You are Dan Mahoney, white man, middle-aged white man. You are therefore incapable of telling me what an anti-slavery regime is. You're complicit within it.
I noticed when I first started teaching in the 80s that, women who were the most influential political women in the world, Golda Meir, Margaret Thatcher, Jean Kirkpatrick, were not considered to be women by, the hardcore feminists or their academic allies. To be a woman was an ideological category. Thomas Sowell, Glenn Lowry, Shelby Steele, Robert Woodson, who, by the way, is there's a more noble voice for Black Americans. I can't think of one. They're not Black because this has become an ideological category. By the way, a homosexual who is against gay marriage or a woman who is for the right to life, they don't fit these preconceived ideological categories. So they simply are written out of the narrative. And this is very, very dangerous for all sorts of reasons. It's the attack on agency. That's why I think this radical sociologism, where people are wholly determined by race, class, and gender. You asked before where this came from. There's three words for you: an incessant. Let's not read Shakespeare. Let's say he's the project of the English patriarchy. He's a white guy. Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's got to go. as the marchers chanted as they destroyed the Great Books program at Stanford in 1988. How demeaning to all people, how demeaning to Black Americans, how demeaning to free-thinking people. It just means that can think, nobody can reason. Everyone is a prisoner. By the way, why these ideologues and activists are not prisoners of their own experience is something they're incapable of answering.
Let me ask
perhaps
you.
Perhaps what they're guided by is will,
Well,
by a fundamental voluntarism.
it's no. I think it is philosophically the move against nature. There is no nature. There is will. There's the naming of things. There's the determining of things according to political categories, and that's it. And that, of course, immediately would shut off liberal education. What would be the point of that? To even have a conversation about truth or what man could know about himself, what it means to be a human person. Why have conservative liberals, tough-minded liberals, sober liberals, whatever you want to call them, found themselves on the back foot? Did they do something wrong? Not necessarily in the last 2 weeks, but 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't know. You probably have seen a couple of these essays that Josh Mitchell, a very good political theorist at Georgetown, has written about the whole woke culture. Josh's argument is this is, as I said before, a toxic and angry moralism that is radically pagan in the modern sense of the term. I don't mean the best pagan. I don't mean Cicero and Aristotle. I mean post-Christian, anti-Christian. That means it has no room for humility, limits, a recognition of imperfection and sin, and above all, no room for repentance or any penitential impulses. The cancel culture really says if you said something, it doesn't have to be really unacceptable. It just has to be perceived today with these ever-changing quasi-totalitarian standards as unacceptable. You were written out of the human race, like the great Soviet encyclopedia of the 30s, where people would get notices saying, cut out the picture of so-and-so or cut out this article. These people no longer exist. Orwell has a few things to say about that in 1984. The people who were zapped or disappeared. No, this lack of mercy, this hardening of hearts, this treating of people as if they're not persons worthy of consideration. It all flows from the animating categories of, you said it very well, rejecting human nature, but also rejecting personhood and agency, which are fundamental traits of human nature. The idea that people can just be dismissed, they are, and sometimes these offenses are non-existent. They're just a decision has been made that so-and-so no longer belongs to the human race.
Yeah.
By the way, I think I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I think that's more or less the spirit that animates the reckless anger of people in the New York Times newsroom, or the editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer is a liberal, and pointing out that burning down buildings in people's homes and livelihoods is a form of violence, and they matter too, and to be dismissed for that.
The editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer fired for approving of the headline, buildings matter too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. By the way, you may have seen the headline about the progressive newspaper in one of the Carolinas when they were, the mob was attacking it. They said, "We're with you. We're with you." It reminds me of a scene in Eugenia Ginsburg's great memoir about the Gulag. She was a Soviet communist, but she ended up in the camps anyway. And she talks about a refugee from Mussolini's Italy who's, arrested for no good reason. And he's about to be shot, and he's yelling, "Io sono comunista." I'm a communist.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't matter. These editors are no longer woke enough. It's the radicalization that took 2 or 3 years in the French Revolution, happening at least in a symbolic way, overnight. And I think these institutions are hopeless. Now, thank God we've got a great independent newspaper like the Wall Street Journal.
They've been indispensable in this.
Yeah, yeah. And thank God, people can criticize Fox News all they want. It adds to the sum total of pluralism. And by the way, we talk about liberalism. One thing tough-minded liberals and tough-minded conservatives can agree on, all of us committed to the liberal order in the fuller sense of the term, is that pluralism is an essential good. Not a relativistic pluralism that says, who's to say what's right and wrong, but a pluralism, the great John Courtney Murray put it, where civility operates. Civility really isn't just, I won't shoot you and you won't shoot me. Civility is always grounded in some kind of mutual moral consensus where
Yeah.
we recognize the common world of reason, a common world of citizenship, a common world of mutual accountability. Without that, it's the war of all against all. And
Yeah.
I think these intellectuals accepted that premise. But it's really kind of amazing. They accept nihilistic premises, but they think in the end justice will arise. Absurd.
Question for you. You've written a lot about, you've thought about the French political thinker Raymond Aron, who had wonderful thoughts about the events in May 1968 in Paris, where they almost toppled a government and were finally stopped by General de Gaulle. Is there things we can learn from him, even though he's 50 years ago in France, for our present situation?
Oh, well, Aron, in his wonderful book, La Révolution Introuvable, The Elusive Revolution, he reproduces many of his columns from Figaro from May, June, July 1968. He was a one-man voice of truth when everyone was going mad. Aron says everyone played a role in '68. He said a lot of people did a good job acting like the Jacobins of Robespierre. And, you had these upper middle class students. Aron says it pained me to see these demi-educated students praising Che Guevara while attacking an authentically great man like Charles de Gaulle. And Aron had his differences with de Gaulle. But Aron says, well, I sort of played the role of Tocqueville, what Tocqueville had played in 1848, the sort of voice of reason against this insane radicalization all around him. And Aron really thought that this tyranny of ideological cliches, one of the most famous is, it is forbidden to forbid. Boy, that manages to be totalitarian and nihilistic all at once. And Aron he was a conservative-minded liberal. He stood up to the fellow traveling intellectuals in the 50s with his great book, The Opening of the Intellectuals. He stood up for the liberal university and for the French Republic in '68. And he made many, many enemies. He even set up a committee to stop terrorism in the universities. So he's a man of utmost courage. And he just could not understand. He could not understand why people who lived in a free and prosperous society were committed to destroying it. I think he thought it was a kind of intellectual contagion, a kind of madness that simply needed to. I think Aron's example is really good because without Aron, I think '68 might have had a different. Without Aron and de Gaulle, '68 may have had a different outcome. Because so many people had given in to this ideological madness. And still in France, I mean, La Révolution Introuvable was re-released last year, but every 5-10 years when there's a celebration of May '68, it is hagiographical.
Mm-hmm.
These
Mm-hmm.
Maoists and terrorists and people who intimidated, and they're celebrated.
Well, they moved through the institutions and write the scripts now.
They do. They do. And I, my French friends always say that '68 is the turning point when, a kind of liberalism rooted in the larger arc of Western civilization really, they didn't establish their Maoist utopia, but they institutionalized the culture of repudiation. And the pensée de 68, post-structuralism, deconstructionalism, anti-Western narrative. That's the leading import from France in the last 60 years. So, and it's part of our problem too. So there's a direct connection between May '68 and what's going on now.
What makes liberal political orders weak? Or are they? We seem, and we just seem, I mean, European political orders right now, nations seem weak, unsure of their purpose. We similarly. Why is that the case? We think about an array of voices, writing now on the right, even in America, also sort of wishing for the end of liberalism, or equating liberalism with the things that are happening now, not making any distinctions. What do we make of that?
Well, I think liberalism has been prone to radicalization and self-subversion. When mutual respect and civility become a debilitating relativism. Deborah Lipstadt, the great critic of Holocaust revisionism, pointed out in one poll, 25% of students said, Holocaust revisionism ought to be given a hearing because they're afraid to say there are any intrinsic ideas of right and wrong, and that goes, things like this. So liberalism sometimes has a hard time standing up to its enemies. And so many liberal intellectuals, left of liberal intellectuals, apologize for totalitarianism in the 20th century, saw communism as more democratic than democracy. So there are problems. But those problems cannot be addressed by some mindless anti-bourgeois ire or by a repudiation of the American founding, or even this. To talk about a radicalization doesn't mean that the radicalization is inevitable or can't be resisted. Bob Riley in his new book, America on Trial, he talks about that there were American founders all the way back in the 1790s, especially Hamilton and Adams, but also George Washington. They knew the French Revolution had nothing to do with us. They didn't like the unreason, the false reason, the murder, the pillaging, the anti-Christianity. And so I think if we're going to defend liberalism, we need to save it from its false friends. There's a great theme of my friend Pierre Menant, that to love democracy well, it is to love it moderately. By which you mean it doesn't mean we love our political order moderately. It means this pure democracy or pure liberalism, where all the contents of life, authoritative institutions, can be wrecked, including the family, including religion. We've already wrecked the university. Without authority, without order, without the sort of moral capital that the founders largely presupposed, but sometimes affirmed. They all believed in, rational moral sense. They weren't relativists. They were not enemies of the Christian religion. I think the liberalism we need to defend it needs a place for statesmanship, for Lincoln, or Churchill, or de Gaulle. It needs a place for intellectual authority. It can't be afraid of truth. But I'll tell you, no good comes from condemning the American founding as part of the problem. I think, as you put very nicely in your review in National Review of Bob Riley's book, you end up agreeing with Justice Kennedy in his famous claim that American liberty is some kind of juvenile existentialism. It has no ends. It's just about anything. David French is the other extreme. He says the Constitution is founded on neutral principles. No, not neutral principles, but not the syllabus of errors. We need a constitutionalism that defends liberty and human dignity and rejects the culture of repudiation. It's so clear to me. I don't understand these binary distinctions between integralism and the woke rejection of American republicanism. We can recover the resources of the American founding, but do so in a way that theorizes the fuller anthropology that they presuppose.
Well, I think what we're dancing around here too is, a weakness of a republic, of a liberal republic, is does it transfer and teach its tradition to the next generation? And I don't think we've done that for 2, maybe 3 generations. And inevitably that vacuum gets filled with a new account of truth, a new account of meaning. And, to me, when I read, say, the Catholic right is doing this, or we look at, say, the New York Times editorial board, that's really what we're witnessing here, is a new account of truth filling a spiritual void.
I agree. And by the way, I have some sympathy for these Catholic traditionalists who the political and historical judgment is wrong, but they are responding to the regnant nihilism, and
I agree with
again,
that.
they're making the terrible mistake of conflating, the principle of our political order with the present madness, and I think that's wrong for 1,000 reasons. But yeah, the renewal is going to have to involve, to use a fancy word, a kind of dialectical reflection, where we repudiate this faux liberalism and leftism while reaffirming the sort of deepest resources of our tradition. And the problem with this kind of position, the position of Brownson or Tocqueville or us, is that it can't be argued in 2 or 3 easy steps. It involves liberal education, civic education. But why did conservatives, why did people of good sense, why did political moderates, why did we allow the elementary and high schools to be colonized by people who teach young people that our civilization is evil and our founding order is corrupt from the beginning? How do we expect, this economic determinism on the right that thinks, as long as the stock market's going up and we have economic growth, let the kids learn all the nonsense. The ideas don't have consequence. I think there was a blindness among too many people who do love this country, thinking that all that nonsense, all those, that race, class, gender nonsense, that doesn't have anything to do with the real world. Yes, it does. It's an absolute subversion of the civic order in the real world. So,
well, it was, I think too, it was my sense looking back, and it's a willingness to look the other way because you don't want to roll up your sleeves and really fight on these hard battles that you have to fight over. And
I think that's exactly right.
It was politically incorrect. And I think I look back at George W. Bush's presidency. Of course, it was assumed by war, but very little desire to take this on. And that was a crucial point when a lot of things were lost. That's just my judgment.
Yeah. It's funny. George W. Bush now is considered to be this, humane alternative to Trump and a good guy. He was as freely compared to Hitler and Nazism as Trump is.
He was hated, reviled. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm disappointed when somebody like him, he issues a statement last week, praising the protesters in the street, but not a word about the violence and the nihilism and the groupthink.
Yeah.
It's cheap. There's an easy phrase for it. It's called cheap grace, easy redemption,
Yeah.
But, we need Churchillian fortitude. We need people who stand up, who are courageous, who are not worried about that wonderful phrase. I think it was Clement Greenberg, the herd of independent minds. I mean, we have a lot of conformity around now, and it takes some risk. But we don't live in a totalitarian regime. No one's going to send us to the gulag.
Well, you might lose your job, which can be very painful.
So you might lose your job.
You might lose your reputation.
Yeah.
My point about, just to clarify on President Bush, was just more specifically the focus on No Child Left Behind, the nationalizing of a curriculum around one metric, which would just be sort of a utility of education and what it could prepare you to do. And what the left has really been focusing on, and it's now become very clear they've succeeded, is not that. It's soulful education, as they deem it. And even under the Common Core standard, that was the same thing, utility. And we have to become much more forthright about, I would argue, the soul and what's the good and what should be read and thought.
We need a recovery of soulcraft in education. It became far too common. I think you're absolutely right about the Bush administration. They pushed STEM. They pushed the utilitarian view of education. They pushed sort of amorphous standards rather than the content of education. The chickens have come home to roost, and all the while the left was redefining what it meant to be an American. They were assaulting the fundamentals of our civilization. But again, this didn't matter. This is just ideas and stuff. A presidential candidate last go round said, why people study Greek philosophy? You're not going to get a job with that.
That too was Rubio.
That was Rubio.
Yeah.
Yes. I didn't mention him on purpose because I didn't want to pick on him twice. But
he needs it. All right.
Yeah, he needs it. But what's silly stuff? Conservatives need to defend authentic liberal education, or true liberals need to defend authentic liberal education, liberal inquiry, and not confuse it with the imposter that has taken over the humanities and increasingly the social sciences and the universities. And again, but I don't know if that's going to be possible because I do already sense a terrible hardening, This is not hyperbolic speech. A new totalitarianism in the university. People are going to get fired.
Yeah. Well, my sense is there has to be a shakeup. It could be federal government directed. It could be we could see some red state legislatures really wake up, and it could also just be market forces. I mean, my understanding from James Hankins, a piece that ran on Law and Liberty this week, is the finances and revenue for higher education are very much are very thin, and many universities could actually close in the next few years because of that. So that too would be an opening, I think.
Well, I had been pretty confident with I think overall response to COVID, but nonetheless, it did great damage to our smaller colleges and universities, maybe to the whole educational system. And I thought colleges and universities simply, out of necessity, would not be able to double down on this thought control. But, events have a way of intervening. But no, Hankins is right, but that doesn't mean that what's left of American higher education won't end up being more illiberal, more coercive, more mindless. And maybe we need new universities. I don't mean just conservative universities, but the kind of thing Warren Treadgold has written about, major efforts to establish places where liberal inquiry and not ideology dominates. And that's going to depend on a renaissance of liberalism, of true liberalism. And because if conservatives can't do it themselves, they're going to need allies. And we'll see if perhaps this madness doesn't give rise to a new sobriety, a kind of recovery of the old verities that have been forgotten. That's always the hope.
My hope is new political coalitions form in defense of a certain liberalism and the good that has to offer. And those coalitions could look very different from the ones we have now. So we don't know.
We don't know. De Gaulle once said, the future lasts a long time. I think we have every obligation to respond to the madness around us. And by responding to it, we can, contribute in our small way to making sure that it doesn't become institutionalized or instantiated in truly awful and dangerous ways. But we don't want to overreact in the sense of saying, everything is finished, because it may very well be that the American people, many of them are looking around now and saying, what the hell is going on? This is not justice. This is not the country I want to live in. The salvation is not going to come from the intellectual clerisy. It's going to come from, some of us it might come from, but it's going to come from the sort of, I'm more Kendallian here. It's going to come from the sort of with a remnant of the deliberative sense of the American people of a kind of common sense that isn't quite dead yet.
Yeah. Dan, well said. Thank you for your time, and we'll keep doing what we do.
A great pleasure. Thank you, Richard.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.